For those in power or vying for it, there can be no rest. Over centuries, kings and queens are crowned, overthrown, imprisoned, reinstated, and murdered.
If this had been the work of fiction, we would think it was pushing credulity.
He still did not have a legitimate male heir.
And I think this is the beginning of the end.
This is a dangerous game of strategy, cunning, and deception.
Mary is undoubtedly the biggest threat to Elizabeth.
Dynasties will rise and fall, all in answer to the ever-present question that fueled civil war and blood feuds, which pitted brother against brother, father against son, cousin against cousin.
Family who killed one another.
Who will wear the bloody crown of England?
I am the king. I am the king.
There was no dynasty like the Tudor dynasty for drama.
This wretched thing, they must have caught me.
This is the Game of Crowns. It's 1484. Civil war has raged on in England for almost half a century. Richard III, who's rumoured to have killed his infant nephews, the rightful heirs to the throne, after imprisoning them in the Tower of London, sits on the throne, safe behind castle walls in London. He is yet to learn that 250 miles west of the capital, a young man is about to land on the craggy Pembrokeshire coast. An army of French mercenaries in tow. He is about to set his sights on the very throne Richard III has battled and butchered his way onto.
Now, his claim to the throne was rather tenuous. His father was the illegitimate son of Catherine of Valois and a relationship with an Owen Tudor. So not only was his claim an illegitimate one, but it also only came through his mother. The odds really were stacked against Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth. Not only did Richard III have the support of the nobles and a much larger army, he was also a seasoned warrior, whereas Henry Tudor had much less experience. But the battle was really decided by the Stanley brothers, who held back their troops of around 6,000 and waited to see which side was likely going to win. They then joined and fought alongside Henry Tudor.
On the battlefield at Bosworth, two armies clash to decide who will sit on the throne. On the battlefield at Bosworth, a king will die, caught in the fray of soldiers' swords and horses' hooves. On the battlefield at Bosworth, a king will emerge triumphant and go on to found one of the greatest dynasties in British history. His name is Henry Tudor. Born January the 28th, 1457 to Margaret Beaufort and Owen Tudor in Pembrokeshire, Henry's claim to the throne is a tenuous one.
Henry VII had a very difficult hereditary claim to the throne, of which he was well aware. It was almost no claim at all.
He becomes king in 1485 when King Richard III is slain at the Battle of Bosworth field. He is crowned King Henry VII of England on October the 30th. Knowing that many of the nobles surrounding him have a stronger claim to the throne than he does, Henry is endlessly paranoid. His reign is one of terror.
He very much rules with an iron fist. People are scared of Henry VII, and he rules through finances. Very cunningly, he dates his accession to the throne to the day before Bosworth field. And that means that anyone who fought for Richard III was actually committing treason against their lawful King of England, which means, of course, he can seize their property or say that they owe him money. And this very much keeps the nobility in line, but he doesn't rule through love.
A key part of establishing the Tudor dynasty on the throne is Henry's marriage to Elizabeth, the heiress to the House of York, in a union which unites the two warring families as one.
And the House of York had always used the symbol of the white rose, and we see it all the time in Yorkist iconography. The House of Lancaster had on occasion used a red rose symbol, and Henry very cleverly actually noted these two symbols and created the Tudor rose, which is a red and white rose, and which symbolised the union of the House of Lancaster and the House of York.
Henry knew that any children they should have would be of both the Lancastrian and the York line, ending in perpetuity the Wars of the Roses. They have a successful marriage, and no less than 7 children are born, securing the next generation in the Tudor dynasty.
Prince Arthur is their eldest, and he is the future of the dynasty.
Arthur, Prince of Wales, was supposed to be the heir that succeeded to Henry Tudor, and much hope and expectation lay on his shoulders.
He wants to use ideas of the legendary King of the Britons, because of course the Tudors are Welsh, the descendants of the Britons. So Arthur is named Arthur to reference King Arthur, and he's raised in his own household, and he's raised to become king.
He was the Prince of Wales. He therefore set up court at Ludlow. In order to secure the realm and to have alliances with other countries, he was also married to the Infanta of Spain, Catherine of Aragon. Tragically, their marriage was to be a short-lived one, for Arthur contracted the sweating sickness and died suddenly in 1502.
This is devastating both for Henry and for Elizabeth.
All of his father's hopes are undone in his eldest son's death, and must now rely upon his only remaining male heir, Prince Henry.
Everything changed for Henry when Arthur died.
He is the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York.
From having been the spare, he was now the heir, and all of England's hopes rested upon his shoulders.
And he's always intended to be a great nobleman, but of course isn't raised to become king. He's declared Prince of Wales, and he now becomes the sole focus of his father's ambitions and his father's efforts, because his father has no brothers. He has no other surviving sons. So Henry VIII is the future of the Tudor dynasty.
Henry VII died in 1509, leaving the throne to his 17-year-old son, now Henry VIII.
Henry VII was never a popular king. Most of his court feared him. So on his death, there is a sense of celebration, of joy that England is now going to get this young and charismatic king. Henry VIII very much resembled his grandfather, Edward IV, who'd been very, very popular. And there is a real sense of hope for the future. He's seen as a true Renaissance prince. He's highly educated. He's incredibly good looking. The young Henry VIII was described as so beautiful, he'd make a pretty woman.
He was very much conversant in the language of courtly love. He enjoyed singing, dancing, composing music, and also playing instruments.
He's athletic, he's very into his sports, he's very muscular and well built, he's very, very tall. He is a king of which England can be proud, and there is very much celebration at his accession to the throne in 1509.
When Henry VIII ascended to the throne, one of his first acts was to ask his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, for her hand in marriage.
However, to marry, the new king has to gain a special dispensation from the Pope in Rome. The Pope approves this, and Henry and Catherine are wed and crowned King and Queen of England, strengthening once again England's alliance with Spain and the rest of Catholic Europe.
When she marries Henry VIII, after several years of waiting, she must have felt that all her prayers have been answered. He is incredibly good looking, and undoubtedly Catherine fell deeply in love with Henry. Catherine of Aragon was raised her whole life to be queen. Both her parents are monarchs. Her mother is Isabella of Castile, and her father is Ferdinand, King of Aragon. So she is incredibly royal.
She was wily and determined, and also courageous. Catherine in many ways was an ideal queen consort. She was supportive of Henry and his many campaigns abroad, but she was also happy to be subservient to him. She was a loyal wife to Henry and also expected loyalty back.
Catherine proves herself to be a good wife and a great queen. Henry adores her, and the country follows suit. She fulfills all her duties as queen save one, securing a male heir.
For the first 10 years of her life married to Henry, Catherine spent most of it pregnant. And tragically, out of 6 children, only one was to survive. In 1516, after many years of sadly losing children, Catherine of Aragon gave birth to a daughter who was christened Mary. Now, it is often stated that Henry was disappointed at the birth of a daughter, but actually I think we have evidence that he was relieved that at last a child was surviving into its infancy.
And while for Catherine, as the daughter of a female sovereign, the idea of a reigning queen is not so alien. For Henry, coming out of the Wars of the Roses, it is a terrifying prospect.
With Catherine 6 years older than Henry and nearing middle age, the king begins to worry. With only one daughter and no legitimate sons, the succession of the Tudor dynasty is not yet assured. The king prays and prays, asking God for a son and for a wife who could give him one. In his wife's gaggle of ladies-in-waiting, he finds the answer to his prayers, a young, fertile, and beautiful woman named Anne Boleyn. Henry had many mistresses during his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. But Anne was a wily woman and does not want to fall victim to every whim and wish of the king, like many of his mistresses had, including her own sister, Mary Boleyn.
Henry VIII was actually quite slow in his advances towards Anne Boleyn, who joined his court in 1522. He actually had a relationship with Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, in the interim years before he turned his attentions towards her. But we know for certain by 1526 that Henry VIII was falling head over heels in love for Anne Boleyn.
Anne Boleyn had always looked for a good marriage because marriage is a way towards social status for women. There is no doubt that Henry adored Anne. He loved her deeply. In his letters, he talks about being struck by the dart of love.
She is insistent. If he was ever to have her, it would be as his wife and queen.
She favoured the French fashions, but also she was highly intelligent. She had been afforded an education that was quite different to the women around her in England. And she also had very radical religious ideas too. So she really rebuffed Henry's advances until she got to the point where Henry offered her a legitimate path, a hand in marriage and a crown.
For the second time pertaining to his relationship with Catherine of Aragon, the king has to seek a special dispensation from the Pope.
The only real way that Henry was going to be able to marry Anne was if the Pope would annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And Anne and Henry knew that the best mechanism for achieving that end would be through the king's minister, Thomas Wolsey.
At Henry's behest, Cardinal Wolsey travels to Rome, where he'll petition Pope Clement to grant the annulment of the king's marriage to the Queen on the grounds that it was and had always been illegitimate.
Anne and Henry placed their hopes in Cardinal Wolsey, and he was dispatched to Rome to try to bring about the annulment.
The cardinal appeals to Pope Clement for an annulment of Henry and Catherine's marriage on the basis that the initial dispensation was void, as the marriage clearly disobeyed instructions in the book of Leviticus, which states that the marriage of a brother's wife was incestuous and would bear no children.
Henry wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon on the basis that she had been his brother's wife. So they're related to within the first degree of affinity. They are, as far as the church is concerned, brother and sister.
This became a matter of international tension. Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, is vehemently against the annulment, as is Queen Catherine herself. Pressure comes from all sides for Pope Clement, as Queen Catherine and King Charles V urge him not to annul the marriage, and Wolsey and Henry push for the dispensation to be made.
While the Pope is in the Emperor's power, he will never grant the annulment of the Emperor's aunt's marriage. The English try and Cardinal Wolsey tries, but he's in an impossible situation. He can never do it. He will never be able to annul this marriage.
Caught between the wills of two powerful kings, the Pope delays his decision as long as possible, the indecision infuriating both Henry and Anne, who begin to doubt Wolsey's loyalty to the crown over the church. Wolsey returns to England without the Pope's annulment.
Wolsey ultimately fails to secure an annulment for Henry from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and this leads to his dramatic fall.
Enraged by Wolsey's failure to secure the annulment, Wolsey is arrested. Henry turns to more drastic measures. Thomas Cromwell, one of Henry's key ministers at court, proposes a new plan to grant Henry's divorce. Reformation.
Henry knows that the Pope is not going to grant his annulment to his first queen, Catherine of Aragon.
There is no solution other than breaking away from the Pope, because if the Pope will not grant the annulment, then perhaps the Church needs to move from the Pope.
And therefore he is greatly influenced by these new thinkers, including Anne Boleyn, and taking the unprecedented step to break with the Church of Rome and to install himself as king, as the head of his new church.
As soon as Thomas Cranmer is confirmed as Archbishop of Canterbury, he disavows his oath of allegiance to the Pope and declares the English Church separate from Rome, with the king as its supreme head. And this is the moment that the English Church goes its own way.
In order to do this, Henry actually elevates himself beyond kingship and proclaims that he is an emperor of his own empire. This is really the beginnings of the British Empire. This is where it all begins.
Anne and Cromwell's shared reformist views make them indomitable allies. And so begins the break from Rome, fueled more by political affair than theological dispute. Having installed himself as the supreme head of this new church in England, Henry grants his own divorce and begins preparations to marry Anne Boleyn. Catherine is given the title the Dowager Princess. Such was Catherine's impression on people that even her enemy Thomas Cromwell said of her, "If not for her sex, she could have defied all the heroes of history." In the winter of 1532, Anne and Henry journey to Calais to gain the approval of King Francis I of France. In a private conference with Anne, he gives them his blessing, and by the time they reach Dover on their ship, they are lovers. They wed hurriedly in secret and again publicly 2 months later, and Anne is crowned queen.
Henry had moved heaven and earth to marry Anne Boleyn, and the price for crowning her was the delivery of the much longed for male heir that Henry so desired. But the child that Anne had in 1533 wasn't a son, it was a daughter, the future Elizabeth I.
Elizabeth was born at Greenwich Palace in September 1533. She's the first child of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, the first since the break with Rome. So her birth was really looked forward to. Henry certainly was expecting a son. We know that, in fact, because he prepares the birth announcements for the birth of a prince. Unfortunately for her parents, of course, she is a girl. And the birth announcements are amended to add an S to say princess.
Now, some historians have suggested that Henry was furious at Anne for the delivery of a daughter, and indeed that this was the beginning of the end of their relationship. But actually we have good evidence that Henry consoled Anne and suggested that the delivery of a healthy daughter was a good sign for the sons that would follow.
Elizabeth's birth was disappointing. He really did want to have a son, but he knew that both he and Anne were young enough to have more children, and Anne does quickly become pregnant again the following year. Henry VIII loved jousting, and it is an incredibly dangerous sport. Once in his youth, actually, he came close to being killed when he forgot to put the visor down on his helmet, and his friend, the Duke of Suffolk, didn't notice and jousted at him, and actually the lance splintered, and he was very lucky to survive.
In 1536, Henry suffered a disastrous accident whilst jousting. Some reports state that he was unconscious, whilst others just mention the fact that he was severely injured.
He fell badly and his horse landed on top of him.
This really changed Henry's lifestyle. It, in many ways, emasculated him.
One account suggests that he was unconscious for several hours. And there are also suggestions that perhaps there is some sort of brain damage.
I think this is a turning point in Henry's life, and not for the better.
He will never recover from his injuries.
I think this narrowing of his abilities, and I think this continual pain that Henry is in, really changes his personality. I think he becomes hot-headed and irrational and would lash out to a degree that he hadn't previously.
And it really hammered home to the king and to his court. He still did not have a legitimate male heir.
Not long after Henry's jousting accident, Anne tragically miscarries.
Anne Boleyn would blame her final miscarriage on the news of the king's accident.
And I think this is the beginning of the end of Anne's life.
Henry told Anne that he could see that he would have no more boys by her, which was particularly ominous.
The trauma of Henry's injury and Anne's miscarriage has put the couple at odds.
Henry, by this stage, was involved with Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, who had herself declared that she would not become the king's mistress.
Thomas Cromwell and Anne, who had once been united in the pursuit of the same cause, are now warring over the king's favour. In the ensuing weeks, Anne makes one crucial mistake. She threatens Cromwell's life.
The end for Anne came very quickly.
Very dramatically, on the 2nd of May 1536, Anne is arrested at the Palace of Greenwich and is taken to the Tower of London. She has no idea why she has been arrested, but two people do: her husband, Henry VIII, and his minister, Thomas Cromwell.
Cromwell poisons Henry against her, and she is arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason. Anne is executed on the 19th of May 1536 by the blade of a French swordsman.
Henry ordered that a cannon was fired at the moment that Anne was executed. And this was his cue to move on. Indeed, he proposed to Jane Seymour the next day, and they were married only 2 weeks later. Compared to Henry's first two queens, Jane Seymour was rather less complicated. She was rather meek and slightly milder than Catherine and Anne, and was certainly happy to be more pliant to Henry's will.
It is a marriage that he hopes will bear sons. Jane comes from a very fertile family. She has many brothers, and he's hopeful that Jane will prove a very different wife to Anne Boleyn. Finally, at the start of 1537, Jane realizes she's pregnant, and when she feels the baby quicken, so she feels the baby move, the whole country erupts into celebration. Henry is incredibly solicitous throughout her pregnancy. He vows to remain close to her so she's not frightened by any rumours. This is probably a reference to Anne Boleyn's final miscarriage and the fact that she blamed it from Henry's fall from a horse.
After many years of heartache, Jane Seymour finally gave Henry the son and heir that he so desperately craved.
When Jane goes into labour in October 1537, the whole country hold their breath, and it's a very long, very arduous labour. Finally, after 2 days, Jane gives birth, and it is a healthy prince, and everybody celebrates.
Henry was elated. There was much celebration throughout the kingdom, and lavish feasts and jousts were prepared.
This is the moment that Henry has been waiting for nearly 30 years.
To Henry's great relief, in October 1537, a son is born, whom they call Edward.
And everything seems all right with Jane. She seems to be recovering well. She's able to send out the official birth announcement shortly after the birth.
But tragically, all was not well in the birthing chamber.
Childbirth is a very, very common form of death for women in the period. And Jane holds on until the 24th of October, 12 days after the birth of her son, before sadly dying in the night.
Henry VIII was absolutely crestfallen at the death of Jane Seymour. He really appears to have entered into a prolonged period of mourning and depression. Henry at this point had gone through a huge amount of heartache. He had gone to extraordinary lengths to secure this son and heir. And then, tragically, his wife had been snatched away from him. He really must have felt that everything was stacked against him at this point.
Heartbroken without his third queen, Henry falls into a deep depression. Thomas Cromwell, one of the king's closest advisors, visits the king. He has a proposal.
So most kings in the period chose their wives for diplomatic reasons. They wanted to make a grand foreign alliance which would bring friendship between the countries. Henry had been unsuccessful in finding a French bride and then an imperial bride.
Rather like Anne Boleyn, Thomas Cromwell was something of a religious radical, and he understood that Henry's kingdom was rather less secure than it should be because of his newly founded Church of England. Therefore, Cromwell's proposal was to create an alliance with a Protestant country.
He explains that Henry should marry Anne of Cleves, in a diplomatic move that would ensure a good relationship with the powerful duchy in the Holy Roman Empire. Intrigued by the proposition, Henry dispatches his favourite court painter, Hans Holbein the Younger, to take her likeness. Months later, the painter returns with a portrait of a young and healthy woman. Henry agrees to the union.
The marriage contract was signed in September 1539, and Anne then made her way towards England.
Henry VIII's first meeting with Anne of Cleves couldn't have gone worse. Anne was supposed to voyage to court to meet Henry, but like a lovesick boy, Henry can't wait to meet her and decides to visit her in disguise.
Henry VIII arrived to find Anne of Cleves looking out of a window at a bear baiting below.
Now, as part of court etiquette and as part of the language of courtly love, Henry's courtiers knew that Henry would often appear in disguise, and they in turn were supposed to recognise the king, no matter what he was wearing. This was to flatter the king. Now, Anne grew up in a completely different environment to this. She wasn't conversant in the language of courtly love at all. And when Henry VIII burst into her chamber, she was completely unimpressed with this man that stood before her.
Her visitor then left the room and returned wearing a purple cloak, which was a cue for everyone to recognise the king. As they fell to their knees, Anne, of course, realised her mistake and recognised that this was Henry VIII, this was her suitor. But the damage had already been done.
And I think actually in that moment, Henry VIII saw, perhaps for the first time in his life, a genuine reaction to how unattractive he had become. Anne hadn't recognised him as this all-powerful, majestic person. She'd simply seen an obese and slightly ageing man before her. Henry would leave that chamber and proclaim, "I like her not," and state that she was nothing like as was depicted in her painting.
Actually, most people seem to have agreed that the portrait was a good likeness, but there was just something about Anne that didn't appeal to Henry.
But I think the truth of the matter was that there was an ugly, ageing and smelly person in that chamber, and it wasn't Anne of Cleves, it was Henry.
Unable to get out of the marriage for fear of offending Europe, the couple marries. Though they divorce soon, as an alliance with Cleves is less desirable. Anne is afforded the title the King's Sister and gifted a great portfolio of properties. Henry is now 49 years old and once more without a queen.
Having served Henry loyally for many years, Thomas Cromwell was now seen by the king as the architect of this incredibly awkward marriage between Anne of Cleves and himself, and he really blamed Cromwell.
The Duke of Norfolk, a noble of conservative views and an old rival of the reformist Cromwell, has another proposal for the king.
Noticing how vulnerable Cromwell now was, waiting in the wings was the Duke of Norfolk, who had never been fond of Cromwell. And he had a niece who was in Anne of Cleves' employ, Catherine Howard. He saw this as an opportunity not only to place his young niece in the king's bed, but also to bring down Cromwell.
He offers Henry the hand of his young niece, Catherine Howard, and convinces him that Cromwell no longer prioritizes the king's wishes, but his own. Having fallen far from the king's graces, on the 28th of July 1540, Cromwell is led to the scaffold at Tower Hill, where the executioner's axe awaits him.
Cromwell has been sent to the Tower of London in disgrace, and he isn't even afforded a trial. He is actually condemned to death by an act of attainder. In his last letter to King Henry VIII, he writes a postscript at the end of the letter, begging 3 times for mercy, mercy, mercy. But no mercy came, and Thomas Cromwell was taken to the public scaffold site on Tower Hill and beheaded on the very day that the king married Catherine Howard.
Catherine Howard is really Henry VIII's midlife crisis. She'd been a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves. She's a teenager.
Henry VIII is absolutely besotted by Catherine. He lavishes gifts upon her, jewellery and clothes. But soon rumours start at court that all is not well with Catherine's past.
She was a woman with a past, or a girl with a past really. She'd had 2 previous lovers, one of which had been consummated.
And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, leaves a letter for the king to find, which details some troubling facts about Catherine's past. At first, Henry VIII is entirely dismissive of these claims, but he does order that Thomas Cranmer investigate. But then things take a turn for the worse. A letter is discovered in the possession of Thomas Culpeper, one of Henry VIII's favourites at court. This is a romantic letter. It talks of Catherine longing to see him, and this sends Henry into an absolute rage. He is blinded by this rage and suggests that he is going to kill Catherine with his own sword. She is confined to her apartments and then is imprisoned at Sion Abbey. But rather unlike Anne, who is dispatched within 19 days of her arrest, Catherine languishes in prison. Henry can't quite believe what has happened. It is reported at this time that there is no more room in the Tower of London, for it is so full of Howard relatives. And eventually Catherine is taken herself to the Tower of London. She is taken to the Queen's apartments and is afforded a private execution on Tower Green. Henry VIII's sixth and final queen was Catherine Parr. Catherine was a relatively young woman when Henry first took notice of her, but actually she had already been twice widowed.
She was very, very reluctant to marry Henry, and actually seems to have been quite horrified when he declared his interest in her. Henry, however, would not be refused. There are claims that Catherine actually said it was better to be his mistress than his wife, but if that was the case, he ignored her and insisted on marriage.
I think at this point in his life, Henry is looking for peace and stability and looks to Catherine Parr to rehabilitate his family life, to bring his children together and to bring harmony once more to the royal family.
Catherine is incredibly fond of the king's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and indeed persuades Henry to restore the girls to the line of succession.
Catherine Parr is an incredibly intelligent woman. She is very well read and has very radical religious ideas too. She's also the first queen to ever publish a book, and the first woman to publish a book in England under her own name and in English.
Henry VIII had been ill on and off for the latter part of 1546, and just before Christmas he leaves the Queen and his daughter Mary and goes to Westminster. And it's clear very quickly that he's dying. He spends his last few weeks cloistered away with his council, and particularly his secretary, William Paget, who is very close to Edward Seymour, Henry's brother-in-law, the brother of Queen Jane, and the uncle of the heir to the throne. During this period, Henry asks that a new will is drawn up. He'd previously made a will in the early days of his marriage to Catherine Parr, and he seems to have named her as regent in the event of his death. But this new will completely overturned that. Instead of naming anyone as regent, Henry in fact established a council of equal ranking executors. So all of these men have an equal role to play, and it was hoped that they would guide Edward through his minority into his adult reign.
On the 28th of January 1547, Henry dies at age 55 at the Palace of Whitehall. His son Edward is little more than 9 years old and is now King of England.
Obviously, he came to the throne as a child. He's 9 years old. He's a shy, uncertain boy at his succession, to the extent that at his coronation he actually forgets his French when he's talking to the ambassadors.
Edward VI was a highly intelligent young man. He was well versed in most subjects, and he was also a radical religious thinker. This was certainly encouraged by his uncles who shared the Protestant faith. In fact, he was something of a religious zealot, and unlike his father, who remained a traditional Catholic, Edward imposed a fully Protestant Reformation on England for the first time.
Edward enacts many Protestant reformations during his short reign. By the time he is 12, multiple Catholic rebellions have been quelled, prayer books published in his native English, and his uncle and protector, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, has been executed.
And although his laws are overturned in the reign of his half-sister, his is the model that is followed by Elizabeth in her religious settlement with her Book of Common Prayer, which is of course Edward's Book of Common Prayer. He matures as a ruler in his 6 years. There are just signs, there are just hints of the monarch that he could have become.
Edward is now 15 and is gravely ill. He has not had a chance to marry and sire an heir, and is loath to let his new Protestant England fall into his sister Mary's Catholic hands.
Edward is a boy king and a fiercely Protestant one too. And his heir at the time is his elder sister Mary, who is a devout Catholic and a Roman Catholic too. This causes enormous tensions between the two. Their differences are so great that Edward cannot conceive of his sister Mary succeeding to the throne and undoing the Protestant Reformation that he has enacted upon the country, and he goes to great lengths in order to disinherit his sister from the line of succession.
By June, he knows that he is dying. He redrafts his will, naming his cousin, the 16-year-old Lady Jane Grey, his successor. She will only be queen for 9 days.
He unfortunately dies at the age of 15, but his legacy is certainly the Protestant Reformation, because it is under Edward that Protestantism becomes established in England. When we think about Edward, we often think of him as a boy king, as a footnote to the reign of his father, but actually the Protestant Reformation really should set his reign apart, and we should look more closely at just what Edward achieved.
In the wake of Edward's death, Lady Jane Grey is suddenly proclaimed queen and is taken to the Tower of London, which is usually at the centre of political power at the point of a coronation.
Mary arrives in London with an army of men and seizes the Tower of London. Lady Jane Grey is arrested and later executed. And Mary takes her rightful place on the throne of England. The eldest child of Henry VIII, Mary is a devout Catholic. She swiftly unravels all of the Protestant policies of her brother and declares her parents' marriage valid. Now aged 37, she starts her search for a husband. She decides to ally herself with Catholic Spain by marrying her cousin, King Philip II. Philip would become her co-ruler and King of England as well as King of Spain.
When Mary came to the throne, one of her first actions was to finally marry, and she chose for her husband King Philip II of Spain.
And it's a really good match for Mary. He is the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, so one of the most powerful princes in Europe. And Mary has always been very close to her Spanish relatives, and so she is very, very excited by her marriage to Philip.
Mary was desperate to beget a son and heir to secure her own succession.
Unfortunately, it is an incredibly unpopular marriage in England, because in the 16th century, the husband of a queen is a king. So whoever Mary marries will become King of England, and nobody wants a Spanish king.
Such was the dislike for a foreign man to sit on the throne of England alongside Mary, rebellion sparks.
Early in 1554, there is a great rebellion against Mary. It is led by Sir Thomas Wyatt and it begins in Kent.
Thomas Wyatt rebels in favour of Princess Elizabeth ascending to the throne.
Wyatt marches his troops up to London. And actually it's a very, very dangerous situation for Mary, and she is urged to flee her capital by her advisors. She refuses and actually makes a speech at the Guildhall in London, and it's absolutely the speech of her life. And we can see Elizabeth modelling later speeches on this. Mary talks about being married to her country, and it really rallies the people of London in her support, so that when Wyatt's troops cross the river into London, they are met with a substantial army, and they are defeated that day.
Mary believes that Elizabeth is part of this conspiracy and arrests her sister, imprisoning her in the Tower of London. Indeed, it is likely she is held in the very same rooms that her mother was once held in. This must have been terrifying for Elizabeth. However, Mary ultimately knew that Elizabeth was her only heir. There was no one else to succeed her. So therefore, she had no choice but to let Elizabeth go.
She is desperate for an heir of her own. She learnt from her own succession to power that without an heir, all her reformation would be undone.
Mary believed that she came to the throne with God's favour, that God had supported her. So she sees her queenship as divinely inspired. So it seems only natural that she will give birth to a Catholic heir to the throne to keep her half-sister away from the crown.
Mary was determined to have a son and heir, and at one point she believed very much that she was pregnant.
So she has all the symptoms of pregnancy, the doctors agree. Everyone is very, very excited, and she makes preparations for the birth. She then retires for her lying in, which is usually about a month before a woman believes she'll give birth. And so she waits, and then she waits, and she waits some more, and nothing happens.
Tragically, this was a phantom pregnancy, and no children ever came from her marriage to Philip.
Heartbroken and grieving, Mary considers her false pregnancy to be God's punishment for her having tolerated heretics in her realm. With her husband away at war with France, the Queen's persecution of Protestants becomes more and more violent. To believe in a different God than that of the monarch was an act of disloyalty, so heresy was both a civil and religious offence which amounted to treason. As a result, many people were arrested, imprisoned, and executed, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who served both Henry VIII and Edward VI. The Archbishop would be one of the thousands burned at the stake for their faith during Mary's reign. As a result of these burnings, she gains the name Bloody Mary.
By the start of 1558, it is clear that it's only a matter of time before Elizabeth takes the throne. Mary is not going to have a child, and her health is declining.
Mary has gone down in history as Bloody Mary, which I think is particularly unkind. She was England's first queen regnant who reigned in her own right. So I think it's uniquely unfair and even misogynistic to land Mary with this really unfortunate title.
The Bishop of Winchester, John White, praises Mary at her funeral service. She was a king's daughter. She was a king's sister. She was a king's wife. She was a queen, and by the same title, a king also.
After only 5 years on the throne and having provided no heir, Mary dies in 1558, leaving her throne begrudgingly to her Protestant sister, Elizabeth.
Following her accession at Hatfield, Elizabeth makes her way to London. She's met by cheering crowds. She is Henry VIII's daughter, and in fact her coronation portrait is very much reminiscent of her father. She's displaying herself as Henry VIII's daughter.
Her coronation is set for 15th of January 1559, an auspicious day selected by the court astrologer Dr. John Dee.
And they hoped that the young Elizabeth would provide more stability, more peace and harmony.
Elizabeth, like her brother before her, is zealous in her commitment to the Protestant cause. But she knows from witnessing firsthand the decisions made by her sister Mary pertaining to religion that forced conversion can only end in terror and in bloodshed.
When Elizabeth became queen, England was a Catholic country. And so the question of what the state religion would be was really on everybody's lips, because she was well known to be a Protestant. In 1559, she created her religious settlement, where she set the state religion, and it was a Protestant church.
But when she came to the throne, she knew that she had to be pragmatic. She knew that she needed to unify her kingdom. She stated that she had no desire to open windows into men's souls. And this must have been something of a relief to her kingdom.
Elizabeth tried to take something of a compromise approach, something of a middle way. Some Catholics refused to come to church. And actually, although Elizabeth has this reputation for moderacy, the penalties against Catholics who wouldn't conform could be very severe and went all the way up to execution.
Elizabeth unfortunately suffered many illnesses during her early reign, including catching smallpox. This created great anxiety throughout the country, and not least in her council. Elizabeth, of course, was unmarried at this point. She had no children, no heir.
Under the laws of succession, the next in line to the throne was Catherine Grey. However, she was then a prisoner in the Tower because she had made a secret marriage to the Earl of Hertford, and Elizabeth, in her anger, had invalidated the marriage and imprisoned Catherine and her husband and Catherine's infant children. If you look at strict hereditary, the heir to the throne was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was unlikely to appeal to anyone in England. She's a Catholic. She's educated in France. She's a foreign ruler. So it's a real constitutional crisis, and the Privy Council meets to decide who will be the heir.
What would happen to the Tudor dynasty if she were to die without one?
No one is quite clear what will happen, and it really hammers home the uncertainties, the fact that the stability in England hangs on the life of just one woman.
The monarch must secure the succession of the House of Tudor. She knows that she is the last of her siblings. She is the third and final of Henry VIII's surviving children. Her advisors think she needs a husband to support her and an heir to succeed her.
Elizabeth actually receives a deputation from the House of Commons not long after she becomes queen, where they petition her to marry. She takes it in very good grace, but she says to them, since I've been a child, I have decided that I'm going to remain unmarried, that I'm going to be a virgin. I'm going to reign as a virgin queen. And it doesn't really cause any stir, which is surprising, but it's because just nobody believed her. It was a ridiculous suggestion that this young girl of 25 would hope to reign as queen. Of course she had to marry. Of course she had to give England a king. Her role was to produce heirs, to continue the dynasty.
I think Elizabeth chose not to marry for a number of different reasons. I think it began at an early age. I think she knew from the example set by firstly her mother and then her stepmother, Catherine Howard, how vulnerable a queen could be at the hands of a king. I think this left a psychological imprint on Elizabeth's mind. I think the thought of marrying terrified her, quite frankly. But also, Elizabeth was determined, perhaps for the first time in her life, to have control over herself and of her kingdom. She had been left incredibly vulnerable by the downfall of her mother, and she had been delegitimised, she had been removed from the succession. And I think in a way, Elizabeth wanted to rule without a husband. She knew that if she had married, her husband would automatically have become a king regnant. And Elizabeth wanted control not only of her own destiny, but that of her kingdom too.
Mary, Queen of Scots, is undoubtedly Elizabeth's rival. Mary was born in 1542, and when she was 6 days old, she became reigning Queen of Scotland. Mary is undoubtedly the biggest threat to Elizabeth, and this is because of her place in the English succession. So Mary is effectively her heir. She is the next hereditary heir to the throne.
Mary, Queen of Scots, was Elizabeth's first cousin, and she had something of a tempestuous rule in Scotland. Indeed, she was forced to abdicate her throne because of her actions.
After she realised she couldn't stay in Scotland any longer, Mary fled to England, and it was the absolute worst decision she could have taken, because Elizabeth was the one person who could never allow Mary to have her freedom, because Mary is such a threat to her rule.
Elizabeth knew that Mary, as a Catholic, would become a figurehead for those who opposed Elizabeth's rule. Indeed, people already thought that Mary had a more legitimate claim to the English throne.
And this really matters to Elizabeth, because Elizabeth is still legally illegitimate. So legally she has no title to the throne other than by Act of Parliament and by her father's will. When Elizabeth hears that Mary has landed in the north of England, she orders that she be placed under house arrest. And Mary remains imprisoned by Elizabeth for 20 years. The two women never meet. Mary is desperate to come to court to plead her case with Elizabeth, but Elizabeth will not see her. Instead, Mary slowly begins to lose hope, and she starts plotting against Elizabeth. And there are several plots, at least, that her name is mentioned in, or that she seems to have had direct involvement in.
Mary did conspire to overthrow Elizabeth and to place herself on the English throne.
Lastly, of course, she is involved in the Babington plot, where she gives her consent to murder Elizabeth. In many respects, this is a really sensible policy for Mary, because actually, were Elizabeth to die at any point during Mary's imprisonment, it's really likely that Mary would be declared Queen of England.
She knows that there's just one heartbeat between her and the English throne. As her endless imprisonment continues, Mary's support for the murder of Elizabeth is evident, if that would lead to her own liberty and Catholic domination of England. Then, correspondence is intercepted by Elizabeth's men that will lead to Mary's demise. The letter reads, "Let the great plot commence." Signed, Mary.
It had been proved without doubt that Mary had consented to murder Elizabeth. Elizabeth knew that Mary wanted her dead.
In 1586, after being convicted of treason, having been implicated in the Babington plot, Elizabeth could not let the Scottish Queen live. Knowing that Mary's execution could spark a war with Catholic Europe, she reluctantly signs the death warrant.
Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle, and her execution sent shockwaves throughout Europe, not least in Spain.
The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, broke international tensions, and the Spanish made a move. Spain invades the English-occupied Netherlands, then turns their enormous fleet of ships upon the island of Britain. The Armada anchored off Calais, readying for attack.
The English were expecting an invasion from Spain, and Philip built a great fleet, the Spanish Armada. So Elizabeth goes to her troops at Tilbury to try and ready her forces.
Elizabeth really showed her mettle at a speech that she gave at Tilbury.
She talks about having the body of a weak and feeble woman, but having the heart and stomach of a king and a king of England. She really rallies the troops. She portrays herself as a war leader.
The Spanish had a much larger fleet and the odds were stacked against the Queen. But then the weather breaks. Storms form and winds blow, scattering the Spanish fleet.
Her commanders, Lord Howard of Effingham and Francis Drake, are able to scatter the Spanish fleet, partly by aid of a Protestant wind that blows in the English favour. The Armada is entirely scattered, and in fact the ships that remain have to sail all the way around Scotland and Ireland to get home to Spain because they just cannot go back down the English Channel.
England sends burning fire ships which scorch and sink the Armada's galleons.
It is a triumph of Elizabeth's reign.
The English sail back to Plymouth victorious.
This is where the mythology of Elizabeth really starts. The truth of the matter is that it was more the weather than anything that Elizabeth had done that was the downfall of the Armada. But this is where Elizabeth, the powerful Virgin Queen, really comes into prominence. It is at this point that the mythology of Elizabeth begins.
From this point onwards, she becomes Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the semi-divine monarch of myth and of magic. Under her steady and guiding hand, England grows more and more prosperous.
If you'd asked Henry VIII back at his death to rank his children, Elizabeth would definitely be the least of his children. And yet, actually, she is the one that we really remember. She reigns for 44 years. It's remembered as a time of general prosperity.
Elizabeth's court was really the centre of power in the kingdom. This is where all of the decisions about policy are made, but it's also a place of great exuberance. Elizabeth loved lavish celebrations, she enjoyed hearty banquets, and above all, she loved dancing.
It's the age of Shakespeare, it's the age of exploration, and Elizabeth's right at the centre, reigning alone.
Elizabeth dies in 1603, and with her dies the Tudor dynasty.
Elizabeth was destined to be the last of her dynasty, and of course she knew this. She had no children, she had no nephews and nieces, there was no one else to carry on the Tudor line. So in part, of course, her legacy is dynastic change and the fact that the King of Scots became the King of England and united the two kingdoms. But her legacy is so much more than this.
Elizabeth died childless, and at the end of her reign came the end of the Tudor dynasty. Actually, I think one of Elizabeth's greatest legacies was demonstrating that a queen could rule in her own right without a man. She was a queen who did not need a king.
She was undoubtedly the woman that proved that women could reign in England. She reigned for over 40 years and she reigned independently. She didn't have a king and she was very much in control of her kingdom.
James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. And a new era dawns in the battle for the English crown.